The exact wrong fiscal policy. Literally, they're doing the opposite of what they should be doing.
In terms of what?
They're talking up tax increases. They tried to pass monumental tax increases. They're over-regulating. They're stimulating inflation. They're pumping demand when they should be focusing on the supply side, and they're not.
I absolutely think that coordination between monetary policy and fiscal policy is a really important question for the review. As you say, we do not want those major policy levers pushing in different directions.
You have probably heard on the news people mentioning the phrase fiscal policy and found yourself in the darkness wondering what that is, and today you don't have wonder no more, as we are going to talk about it. In this video we are going to talk about fiscal policy. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You see, the government has many tools at its disposal. They can't just go around building roads and patting people on their backs all day. No, they have to have a plan, a solid strategy for boosting the economy. This is why we have fiscal policy. And you know what? Most of it is pretty sound. On top of this, there are a lot of countries with no fiscal policy at all, or even worse, and most don't even have anything close to positive fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the use of government spending and taxation to influence the economy. In a nutshell, fiscal policy is the use of government spending and taxation to influence the economy. The most common way this happens is through deficit spending, spending more than you take in, which causes inflation and can lead to a recession if not done correctly. Another way is through raising taxes, which decreases disposable income and can lead to a recession if not done correctly. There are two types of fiscal policy: monetary policy and fiscal policy. Monetary policy involves using central banks to adjust interest rates, while fiscal policy involves adjusting taxes or spending levels in order to affect economic growth or stability. Fiscal policy has been used much more extensively than monetary policy over the past century, but there are still many challenges facing it today as we try to get out of an economic crisis that began with subprime mortgages and has now spread around the world. For example, in a democracy there is little direct control over fiscal policy, as most decisions are made by elected representatives. In a dictatorship such as China or North Korea, however, there is little scope for debate on fiscal matters. The most important thing about fiscal policy is that it involves spending and taxing decisions by governments at all levels, federal, state and local, as well as central banks such as the Federal Reserve System in the US, which controls short-term interest rates by buying bonds from private investors when they want to raise their long-term interest rates, and sell bonds when they want to lower them. The history of fiscal policy is a complicated one. It's also an important one that we shouldn't gloss over. John Maynard Keynes is most known for his ideas about fiscal policy. Keynes was a British economist who believed that government spending should be used to help economies recover from recessions. He thought that if a government spent enough money, it would create jobs and increase demand for goods and services. This would cause prices to rise, which would lead businesses to hire more people and invest in new equipment. The hope was that these investments would create enough economic activity so that unemployment would be reduced and output could grow at a faster rate than usual. Keynes also believed that governments should borrow money from banks in return for paying them interest on their loans. This way, governments could use this money to pay for things like infrastructure projects, education programs, or social welfare programs like unemployment insurance. There are three main categories of fiscal policy. The first one is leveraging, or expansionary, fiscal policy measures to increase aggregate demand, such as a temporary tax cut, a temporary increase in government spending, or an increase in government borrowing. The second is involving fiscal policy in the determination of monetary policy, and lastly will be restricting deficits for long periods of time, so that they do not add to long-term debt levels. The stance of fiscal policy is one of the most important factors in determining whether a country will experience economic growth or decline. The stance of fiscal policy refers to the government's approach to budgeting and taxation. It can be broken down into three major categories. Expansionary fiscal policy. This type of fiscal policy involves increasing spending as a means of stimulating the economy and increasing employment. For example, if a country experiences high inflation, it may increase its spending on infrastructure projects in order to stimulate growth. The federal government may also increase its spending in areas such as healthcare and education. Contractionary fiscal policy. This type of fiscal policy involves decreasing spending as a means of reducing inflation and stimulating economic growth. For example, if a country experiences low inflation but is experiencing high unemployment, it may decrease its spending on healthcare and education programs as it seeks to reduce unemployment rates. Balanced fiscal policy. This type of fiscal policy attempts to maintain a balanced budget by reducing both tax revenues and government expenditures at about equal rates. One of the most important things someone can do to help their country is to contribute to its fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the function of a government that manages its budget, and it is one of the ways in which a government affects its economy. There are three main methods of funding for fiscal policy: taxes, debt, and cuts in spending. Taxes are the most common method of funding for fiscal policy, and they account for about half of all tax revenue collected by governments around the world. Taxation comes in two forms: direct and indirect. Direct taxes include income taxes, corporate taxes, sales taxes, capital gains taxes, and property taxes. Indirect taxes include import duties on goods coming into a country's borders, tariffs, export duties on goods leaving a country's borders, duties, excise duties on products such as gasoline or tobacco, sales taxes, value-added taxes, VATs, luxury car taxes, sales taxes, and value-added tax on real estate transactions, VAT. Taxes can also be used to provide funds for social programs such as healthcare or education. The amount of money raised by taxation depends on political decisions about how much to raise and where it should be spent. Another method of funding will be borrowing. Suppose the government wants to build a bridge, but it doesn't have enough money in its budget to do so without borrowing. To pay for the bridge, it first needs to borrow some of the money it needs. It does so by selling bonds on the financial markets, which gives them access to more funds than they had before. The government then uses this additional funding to build the bridge and repay its debts. Once this is done, however, there are still fewer resources available in the economy than there were before, all because of the construction project itself. If the government calls on the central bank to buy $100 million worth of bonds, then the central bank goes out and finds $100 million worth of people who want to sell their homes or cars or stocks and give them up. It then creates an IOU, informal document acknowledging debt, out of thin air, which it sends to the government. The government returns that IOU by purchasing bonds from the central bank with newly created cash, which is backed by future tax revenues. This is all done in order to create a financial asset, the bond, that can be traded as cash or used as collateral for loans by banks or other financial institutions. The central bank creates this asset by borrowing from itself, but only temporarily, at least until it has time to pay back its debts with interest. The idea behind this process is that if you have enough people who are willing to lend you money, then you don't need taxes or borrowing from foreign governments, because they will be willing to lend you money in exchange for bonds issued by your central bank that they can collect interest on later on down the line when they sell them off at a profit again. The main goal of fiscal policy is to change economic conditions in a way that influences the overall health of an economy. For example, if a government wants to increase employment and lower unemployment, it will increase spending on infrastructure projects like schools and roads, which will create jobs for construction workers. If it wants to reduce unemployment, it will cut taxes or increase government spending less than inflation so that businesses can choose not to hire more employees. The first step in understanding how fiscal policy affects the economy is to understand what a tax change does and doesn't do. Suppose you have a new tax that raises $100 billion by 2021. If you don't spend any of that money, then by 2021, the end of your 10-year budget window, there will be $90 billion less in the economy than if you had not raised taxes in the first place. But suppose instead you spend all $100 billion right away. By 2021, there will be $110 billion less in the economy than if you had not raised taxes at all. So raising taxes reduces GDP tomorrow by more than just cutting spending today, it reduces GDP over time by more than just cutting spending today. The government can improve its fiscal policy by increasing spending and decreasing taxes. Higher spending means that the government will have more money to spend on the people, businesses, and the government itself. This can be done by increasing the minimum wage or reducing taxes for low-income families. Lower taxes mean that there will be less money in the government's account and therefore it will have less to spend on things like schools, roads, food stamps, and other social programs. The government could reduce corporate tax rates as well as payroll taxes, which would also result in more money being spent on employees' wages.